Hi, folks. So this is just a screencast for those of you that missed the first lesson. So I'm just going to run you through what it was that was covered, and that should enable you to be able to write the homework that you've received. Those of you that were in the lesson, you can use this as a recap as well, and then hopefully that should help you on your way, because it is pretty complicated stuff. So you have a WILF, and these are the different levels of learning. So actually, you might get that far, you might get that far, you might get that far, you might get that far. Really, you guys should at least be aiming for down here. So to be able to give a simple description of the Hindu idea of God, to name and describe the different gods of the Trimurti, to link the different aspects of the Trimurti by explaining how they link to Brahman, and to consider how the use of analogy can help in understanding this really complicated idea. Can you create your own analogy? So what is it that we mean by analogy? Well, sometimes in order to understand a complicated thing, it helps us actually if we look at something else that we find easy to understand first, and then that can help us with our understanding of the complicated idea that we're looking at. So the analogy that we're going to be looking at is water. And by looking at the nature of water, that is going to help us to understand the idea of their God. Incidentally, this symbol in the right-hand side here is the symbol that represents their idea of God. So we started having a look at water by asking the question, what is water? And lots of people in class gave loads and loads of different responses. Some people said that water was a liquid. Other people said it was the source of life. Other people gave really scientific responses and said that actually it was a compound liquid made up of loads of different elements, etc., etc., etc. All of which was really impressive. But it led us to the next question, which was, okay, well, if all of you guys have different explanations for what water is, well, then is water one thing or is it many things? And then we had a really interesting discussion about that. And what we did was we came to the conclusion that actually water was one thing, but it could be lots of different things. I'm going to explain more about that later, but hold that in your mind. Water is one thing, but it can be lots of different things. So we then said, okay, well, then what if I do that? What is that? So some people got it straight away, and they said, well, sir, that's the symbol of H2O. So we got an H here, two H's, and one O, and you got these different mathematical symbols above it. And we said, okay, crikey, that looks quite complicated. So actually, why, when I look at that, does that make it difficult for me to see water in my head? I don't look at that symbol and think, wet. I don't look at that symbol and think, movement. So why is that? So what we said was, okay, well, actually, the reason is that this is a compound. In other words, it's something which is made up of different elements. And that makes it quite difficult to understand. It's quite complicated. So we've got a compound made up of different elements, and that makes it quite complicated. So maybe it would be easier for us to understand the nature of this symbol, this compound. Maybe actually if we don't look at this, but actually we look at it in different forms. Well, yeah, maybe it does, because actually when I look at that, I think wet, and when I look at that, I think hot, and when I look at that, I think cold. So why is that? Why do these different forms of H2O help me to understand the nature of H2O better, rather than just looking at a really complicated symbol? And we said, well, actually, that compound, it's got different properties. And by looking at the different properties, we understand the characteristics, the aspects of that symbol and what it represents better. So we've got different forms, and by looking at the different forms, we understand the properties of H2O better and the different characteristics of H2O better. Now that's the same in Hinduism. Can you see that symbol again? It's the same. Now this is their complicated symbol, and this represents not H2O, but Brahman. It's called Om, this symbol, O-M, and it represents Brahman. Now, Brahman is their one supreme being. It's their one God. But their one God isn't like a kind of Christian one God in the sort of same Christian way with a guy with a big white beard sitting on a cloud. Their one God is a force. So rather than me explain to you actually what they mean by a force, I thought Obi-Wan Kenobi could instead.
The Force? The Force is what gives the Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us. It binds the galaxy together.
So we've got a complicated symbol that represents God, Brahman, and their God is not a dude like Obi-Wan with a white beard sitting on a cloud. It's a force. It's an energy field. Now, that's quite difficult to understand, just like H2O is difficult to understand. So in exactly the same way that scientists find it easier to understand H2O by looking at it in its different forms, Hindus do the same with Brahman, with their symbol. Symbol, different forms. God, different forms that make it easier to understand their God. So, Hinduism is a monotheistic religion. Mono, if I walked into school with a monobrow, you'd all laugh at me because I'd have one eyebrow. Mono means one. Monotheistic, one God. Now, their one God is Brahman, this one in the middle. And everything that you hear about Brahman is going to appear down the right-hand side next to the water, because I want you to think about that analogy that we talked about that helps us understand the nature of God as it appears down the right-hand side. So their one God is Brahman, and they break Brahman down into different forms, just like H2O, looking at it in different forms of liquid, ice, and steam. Now, their different forms for their God have a special name. They're called deities. And these deities, these different forms, all represent different aspects of Brahman. They are different forms that helps to understand the different characteristics of Brahman. And each of these is worshipped separately as a different god. Now, why? Because you said that actually they believe in one God. Well, don't forget, these are just different forms of one God. So the three most important aspects of Brahman have a special name. And that special name is the Trimurti. If I had a tricycle, I'd be riding on a cycle with three wheels. Murti comes from an old Sanskrit, old Indian language word meaning forms. So the word literally means three forms. And you have Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the preserver, and Shiva, the destroyer. So these are the three forms, the Trimurti, the three most important aspects of Brahman. And they represent the cycle of life. Things are born, they live, they die, they are reborn. So what I want you to do is to explain to me what Hindus mean when they describe God as one thing with many forms. That's your title. That's your essay title. And you're going to use words to explain what you think they mean by this. And then you're going to draw your own picture, a symbolic illustration, your own picture to back up that shows us your understanding of one God with many forms. Now, to do that successfully, I want at least 150 words. Should be more, really. And I want to see paragraphs and advanced language. And your picture might look something like that. So I wish you the very best of luck, folks. Off you go.